Welcome. Welcome to the Nashville Bar Association presentation of Hoffa. It's my honor and privilege to introduce this ceremony in CLE. You will learn about local lawyers breaking the law and committing jury tampering. You will hear about lawyers doing what's right even against their own colleagues. And you will come to know the details of an event befitting a Greek tragedy. Here's what you'll learn. The presentation will begin with the facts that led up to the case of United States versus James R. Hoffa, the president of the Teamsters. And then we'll move to discussion of the trial of the so-called test fleet case, where the jury tampering occurred. Finally, we will explore the disbarment of Tommy Osborne, who was an officer of the Nashville Bar Association and who won Baker versus Carr before the United States Supreme Court just shortly before all these events occurred. The presentation will be both live and by video. My own role is that of an archaeologist. I inadvertently discovered the record of the federal judges of my court disbarring Tommy Osborne. Later, as a part of a pending case, I read the secret grand jury transcripts of the grand jury that indicted Jimmy Hoffa for jury tampering. Some of those documents are in your materials today. I'm convinced this history should be told by and to the Nashville Bar Association. And it is a cautionary tale. And with that, I want to introduce our first speaker, Mr. Ed Yarborough, who's a great lawyer in his own right.
Thank you very much, Judge Campbell. This presentation today will be very similar to one that occurred here almost 3 years ago. Some of you may have been in attendance that day in November of 2012, the very week of the national election, when we did a program on Baker versus Carr. And we discovered after that show that there were a lot of people in the Nashville Bar Association who had come to appreciate a CLE program like that focused on the history of lawyers in Nashville and blended that with national history. And many, of course, did not realize what a great impact local lawyers had had on a landmark case like that. And as you do this type of CLE work, you run across things you didn't know, and it's the same old story. You know, the teacher learns more than the student. And so I want to share with you now a brief video from one of Nashville's great newspaper reporters and let him tell you in first person about his first encounter with Jimmy Hoffa.
My first encounter with him is he was in town for some reason, and Siegenthaler always wanted to confront him and see if he had anything to say, and to get away from the pack of other reporters and all. I bribed a bellman at, I think, the Noel Hotel, and he told me what room Hoffa was staying in. So I was lurking in the hall when Hoffa came up to his room, and I tried to question him and didn't get anything out of him, of course. Several weeks after that, he was back in town on a Saturday to speak to the entire membership of the Teamsters local union at War Memorial Auditorium. And of course, press wasn't allowed. And so Siegenthaler had me put on a t-shirt and sunglasses and a dirty baseball cap, and I was milling around in the lobby of War Memorial, and Hoffa came in for his appearance, and he was trying to shake every hand in the whole crowd, and I was trying to retreat and hide from him. And finally, he was determined to shake every hand, and finally I got cornered in a corner, and approached me, and then he said, "We've met before," and he motioned to two of his bodyguards or whatever, and they took me outside, and one sat on either side of me on the steps of the War Memorial while Hoffa delivered his speech inside. So that was my most memorable encounter with Hoffa. I was 22 years old.
And there he is, 53 years ago, chasing Hoffa with his dark glasses on. Now, I don't know if we have any members of the press in attendance today, but in case we do, we suggest that you might gather more news if you try to buy off the bellhop, or if you disguise yourself and go to the War Memorial Auditorium. Just an idea. We're not recommending that as lawyers. Now I'd like to move to our overview, who's going to be brought to you by another great reporter from Nashville, John McLemore, if you'll make your way on up. John reported for the other newspaper that we used to have called the Nashville Banner in the 70s and covered a lot of state and federal trials, and he's going to give you the overview of today's presentation.
The television and radio stations of the United States and their affiliated stations are proud to provide facilities for a discussion of issues in the current political campaign by the two major candidates for the presidency, the Republican candidate, Vice President Richard M. Nixon, and the Democratic candidate, Senator John F. Kennedy.
I'm not satisfied when the Soviet Union is turning out twice as many scientists and engineers as we are. I'm not satisfied when many of our teachers are inadequately paid, or when our children go to school part-time shifts. I think we should have an educational system second to none. I'm not satisfied when I see men like Jimmy Hoffa in charge of the largest union in the United States, still free.
What many people do not realize is John F. Kennedy, as a senator, was a member of the McClellan Committee. He wasn't just a member who showed up occasionally. If we could, let's take a look at Senator Kennedy in action.
He introduced a bill to correct abuses of big business and big labor. Opposing the bill was Jimmy Hoffa, leader of the Teamsters Union.
I would be very happy to have our legal counsel here, our legislative representative here, assisting me in spending as much time as necessary to acquaint the American people with the fact that this is a strike-breaking, union-busting bill, in my opinion.
Mr. Hoffa, this bill is not a strike-breaking, union-busting bill. You're the best argument I know for it. Your testimony here this afternoon, your complete indifference to the fact that numerous people who hold responsible positions in your union come before this committee and take the Fifth Amendment because an honest answer might tend to incriminate them. Your complete indifference to it, I think, makes this bill essential.
That's not the John Kennedy that you normally see on reruns on TV. That was a man who had sat through enough to understand there was a major problem involving labor and organized crime. I wish that we could have found the tape of RFK appearing a few months earlier on the Jack Paar show, where Jack Paar casually asked the question, who is the worst? Dave Beck, the former president of the Teamsters, or Jimmy Hoffa, the current president of the Teamsters? And Kennedy, RFK, immediately jumps on that and says, Dave Beck is nothing but a thief. And follows up with this diatribe against Jimmy Hoffa, ending up with, unless something is done, this country is not going to be controlled by the people, but is going to be controlled by Johnny Dio, Jimmy Hoffa, and Tony Ducks Corello. Tony and Johnny Dio were in the New York mob. Apparently, RFK forgot that he was no longer in the hearing room in the Capitol, and it resulted in a $2.5 million libel suit against him brought by his good friends Tony Ducks and Johnny Dio. Jimmy Hoffa was a powerful, charismatic leader. He could lead men. The problem that was confronted by the McClellan Committee, which began in 1957, was the relationship that the Teamsters Union had with organized crime. The McClellan Committee was the biggest game in town. It was the biggest in a congressional investigation since the Teapot Dome. They heard over 3 years, 1,600 witnesses. And they heard, it was a place for every possible thing to happen. There was grandstanding. There were mafia boss after mafia boss coming in and taking the Fifth Amendment, which the president just referred to. There was Jimmy Hoffa coming in and refusing to take the Fifth, and so he was playing the role of the artful dodger, and sometimes went to extremes. And then there was a 420-pound made mafia fellow who was told by his lawyers, do not do anything but take the Fifth Amendment. He kept the committee in stitches for 2 days. He was so funny, by the second day of his interrogation, the committee room was completely filled to capacity. But what did the McClellan Committee actually accomplish? It showed, without question, the relationship between organized crime and the Teamsters Union. There had been a lot of criticism of Bobby Kennedy because he could not pin these people down. When he was dealing with some of the best liars and dodgers there were. And think about this. In 1957, when the hearing started, he was 31 years old. He had never tried a case in his life, and the history of that is extremely interesting because what we are talking about when we talk about the McClellan Committee is we're talking about the Senate Permanent Subcommittee on Investigations. Estes Kefauver from Tennessee had taken that committee and investigated and proved to everyone but J. Edgar Hoover in 1950 that there was a mafia, an international crime organization. The committee's torch passed to Joe McCarthy. We know what Joe McCarthy did. He chased communists. Joe McCarthy was a very close friend of the Kennedy family, and he hired Bobby Kennedy virtually right out of law school to be an attorney for his committee. When Bobby Kennedy realized that Joseph McCarthy was on a collision course with disaster, he resigned from the committee. But his relationship with big-time Senate investigations was there, and Clark Mollenhoff of the Des Moines Register started probing him, pushing him. Go back, McClellan is going to get the appointment. McClellan is going to be the next man to head the committee. Get him to hire you back and get him to investigate racketeering in the Teamsters Union. And that was effective. That worked. And that is exactly what happened. Also, keep in mind, before the McClellan Committee, there were no rules of evidence, and there was nobody who could really pin a witness down and force him to answer questions. Bobby Kennedy became very frustrated one day and thought he had Hoffa in a corner, to which Hoffa responded in almost poetic, almost in verse. To the best of my recollection, I must recall on my memory, I cannot remember. From these hearings, the fear rose as more and more people realized the relationship between the Teamsters Union and organized crime, that there could be a time when Jimmy Hoffa and the Teamsters could shut down a city, could cause national chaos. Jimmy Hoffa's great goal, he had two goals. One, to be president of the International Brotherhood of Teamsters. Two, he wanted a national transportation contract so that every truck driver in Seattle, Washington was paid exactly the same as every truck driver in Selma, Alabama. And he was headed in that direction. He always denied that a national strike or the stranglehold on, say, the city of Chicago were impossible. And he would always point out the same thing. I don't control the ships, I don't control the trains, and I don't control the barges. Well, none of those can back up to a loading dock. To the Teamsters, he would always say, if you got it, a truck driver brought it to you. And that was his way of saying, we've got them where we want them. How did it start? It started in 1931 on a loading dock in Detroit, Michigan, the Kroger warehouse. One of the great characters of all labor history, Al Hastings, the meanest man in the world, was Hoffa's boss. Hoffa was a 17-year-old, 170-pound, 5'5" 1/2 inch tall dock worker. He never had that last adolescent growth spurt. He was always 5'5" 1/2 inches tall. Hastings was horrible. This was a situation where you only got paid when you worked. Men were having to stay on the docks for 60 hours a week in order to get 40 hours worth of work in. And Hoffa joined with 5 other men in an attempt to create a union at that location, and they were successful. We don't have time to go into the strawberry incident, but you can read about it in the program materials. Nonetheless, he was successful in his first work stoppage. That led to his becoming a Teamster organizer and a reputation for a leader who leads from the front. Teamster legend is that he was arrested 19 times in one day off the same picket line. And it is not legend, it is history. He was bloodied many, many times. His daughter, who became a judge, has given an interview in which she talks about her father coming home and her mother patching him up and sending him back out to involve himself in violent Teamster activities. How did he get involved with the mob? A girlfriend. She did not marry him, but she introduced him to the St. Louis mob, and from there he made connections around the nation. As he rose in the Teamster organization, he made more and more contacts with mobster families. He knew Johnny Dio, the Provenzano family in New Jersey, the Dorfmans in Chicago, the Buffalinos in Pennsylvania, Carlos Marcello in New Orleans, and Santos Traficante in Miami. They all worked with him. The mob works using extortion as a tactic, and in his book, Frank the Irishman Sheeran, the book is I Heard You Paint Houses, tells how he organized, at the Teamsters' direction, the cab drivers in Detroit. It was very simple, he said. All you have to do is wait for a cab driver to go in, to get a cup of coffee, to take a break. You steal his cab, you drive it down to Lake Michigan, you roll it into the river or into the lake, and then you go back and you get another one. Now, this can sound funny, and Frank the Irishman, who was absolutely certified mafia killer, and he didn't write, but he dictated, and a book was written, and it's going to be a movie soon, about what he did during his lifetime, is making a statement against his own interest here and explaining what he did. But he was destroying the lives of other workers simply because they wouldn't join the Teamsters. In 1958, the situation got so bad, partially forced by the McClellan Committee, that the AFL-CIO ousted the Teamsters from its organization. But that was just a small part. The hooliganism was one side of it. There was another altogether. As Hoffa became more and more powerful, he had the ability to move the money. And he took the Michigan Conference of Teamsters Welfare Fund and the Central States Health and Welfare Fund and placed them in the Union Casualty Agency in Chicago under the control of the Dorfmans, who had no experience with insurance and no experience of any type with money management. The first organization that I can remember as a boy hearing related to $1 billion, other than government spending, was the Central States Fund. It was approaching $1 billion. And under the control of the Dorfmans at Hoffa's behest, it was a political slush fund, it was routinely embezzled, and it built Las Vegas. Loans were made to the mob over and over and over again, and of course, with every one of those loans, there was some sort of kickback. Keep this in mind. Jimmy Hoffa loved power. He was a megalomaniac. But he liked money too, unlike other megalomaniacs that we've had. Robert Moses in New York, who handled the transportation system there. Mr. Mulholland in Los Angeles, who handled the water system. J. Edgar Hoover, probably our most famous megalomaniac. None of them cared a thing about money. Hoffa liked money, and Hoffa made sure the money got to him. He sucked down millions of dollars. Clark Mollenhoff, and I think it's very important that we recognize that the Hoffa story came out because of some very, very brave reporters. Clark Mollenhoff not only encourages the McClellan Committee to go after the Teamsters and racketeers, he starts feeding them information. And the same thing happened in Nashville. Jimmy Hoffa decided that Tennessee was much too reluctant about unionizing, and so there needed to be some quote-unquote mind changing in the South. And he sent a group of men down here who were thugs, and they were in the business of organizing unions, and they did it by intimidation of the businesses. They did it by shooting at trucks that were driven by non-union drivers. They did it by pouring syrup in gas tanks. Anything that they like to bomb things. There was a fellow in Nashville named Hard of Hearing Smitty who would blow your house up in a New York minute and lived around Nashville for years and years and years and negotiated for Local 327. John Sigenthaler started covering that, and his stories got to the McClellan Committee. And in particular, one of his stories was about 13 of these thugs down in Chattanooga who were caught and indicted. And their case came up before criminal court judge Ralston Schoolfield. Ralston Schoolfield quashed the indictment, and those men were let off. Shortly thereafter, Glenn Smith, the president of the Chattanooga Union, appears before U.S. District Court Judge William E. Miller in a jury trial on tax evasion charges. He shakes the foundations of the state of Tennessee in the middle of the trial when he takes the stand and he said, "Whoa, this money that I have, this $18,500 that I was supposed to list on my tax return, is not my money. I'm just a conduit. It came from the Teamsters. I took the money from the Teamsters and I carried it to Ralston Schoolfield to pay for a little trouble that 13 guys were having down there in Chattanooga. I'm not guilty of tax evasion." Well, the jury convicted him anyway. Judge Miller set aside his verdict because he said he's not guilty of tax evasion. He's been charged with the wrong charge. This gave Tennessee such a black eye that Governor Frank Clement asked the state legislature to impeach Ralston Schoolfield. Who has the information? Who has the accountants? Who can track the money to find out where the $18,500? And if you read about this, you'll read about it and read about it and read about it, and you will find out that every time Glenn Smith talked about the money, it was $18,500. Every time the committee talks about the money, it was $20,000. Who got the other $1,500? That's what I've been asking as I prepared for this. Nobody will ever know that. But at any rate, this brings Bobby Kennedy into Nashville as a witness for the prosecution. That's when he met the Nashville Bar. That's when he met the lawyers that were here. That's when he interacted with Tennesseans. And he said himself, I believe Tennesseans are the most honest people I've ever seen in my life. And this played a big role in what was to come. On election night, 1960, the lines were drawn. Bobby Kennedy and the McClellan Committee had seen Jimmy Hoffa indicted 4 times, and their record was 0-4. I'll not go into those cases. I'll tell you a couple of really interesting things. One was in New York City and was an eavesdropping case. Jimmy Hoffa had every one of his men who were called before a grand jury wear a wire. It was called a minophon. It was about the size of a paperback book and had a wire microphone in the lapel. Every one of them got into the grand jury rooms. They recorded their own testimony, and that was to make sure, for Hoffa to make sure that they weren't saying what they shouldn't be saying. That was one of the indictments. 11-1 for conviction, but they didn't get the conviction. The other was really interesting. You could sort of call it a rain out, because it was a real estate scandal or fraud down in Florida, and the prosecution was looking really, really good when the Teamsters gave Richard Nixon $1 million campaign contribution, and the Attorney General called down there to those guys and said, let's not prosecute anymore on Mr. Hoffa, let's leave him alone. But that's for an entire different program that we could do. The lines were drawn. The election went overnight. We didn't find out until the next morning that John Kennedy had won. We wouldn't find out for several weeks that Robert Kennedy would be the Attorney General. But we know what Jimmy Hoffa said when he looked at the television and saw that John Fitzgerald Kennedy was the next president, and that is, I'll have to hire 200 more lawyers to stay out of jail. And so that gets you up to what happened in Nashville. Thank you.
All right, there's your appetizer. Pretty good, huh? Yes, Nashville. Now, there's several connections. John alluded to them. Again, if you were here 3 years ago, you know about the story that John Hooker Jr. told about going to the Hermitage and spending the evening with Robert Kennedy and becoming his friend. And that actually was one of the pivotal moments in the Nashville connection. But there were many others. John Siegenthaler was special assistant to Bobby Kennedy in the Kennedy Justice Department. And obviously, Jim Neal, a member of the famous Vanderbilt class of '57, was friends to both of those and became the prosecutor in the Tess Fleet case, which is the subject of our next presentation by Frank Grace, another former chairman of the Historical Committee. So Frank, come on up here and tell us about the Tess Fleet case, which is actually U.S. versus Hoffa and I believe the carriers on the screen.
I've got a little bit more scene setting to do before we actually get to the case. John alluded to, by the end of the McClellan hearings, things had not gone well for Bobby Kennedy. The Teamsters continued to grow, and likewise the mob figures that they dealt with, mob organizations they dealt with. This was the time when Hyman Roth and Godfather II said to Michael Corleone, "We're as big as U.S. Steel." That was the end of 1959. Of course, they fell in Cuba after that, but then no worry. They had the pension fund and the Dorfmans in Chicago to finance Vegas and everything else. So the Teamsters had grown through this period, 59, 57 through 61. Bobby Kennedy, in the meantime, had been horribly embarrassed. The bill that his brother's talking about, they're talking about the hearings on this bill, was going to be the Kennedy-Irvin bill. It became the Landon-Griffin Act. Bobby couldn't get any indictments, couldn't get the Justice Department to take any of these cases up. There's one case where they photographed Hoffa giving a bribe to one of the committee members. Could be a mole in the committee. And Bobby said, if I lose that case, I'm going to jump off the Capitol. Edward Bennett Williams caused him to lose that case. Hoffa sent him a parachute. There was bitter, palpable hatred between these two. Bobby Kennedy became Attorney General in 1961. The rap on Kennedy at that time, of course, many of you remember, he was inexperienced, naive, never tried a case in his life, just a rich man's son. He had some abilities, though. By the time he took office as Attorney General, he had run 2 major national campaigns, the primary in 60 and the general election in 60. To run national campaigns, or any kind of campaign, locally for that matter, it takes a lot of ability. It takes organizational sense, it takes an ability to assess people, build teams, identify goals, organize the people, give them vision, and move them towards that goal. He'd done that and done it very, very well. And when he got to the Justice Department, he'd learned from his mistakes, and while he was still brash and perhaps arrogant, he was tough, and he brought his skills to bear on the Justice Department. It created an interagency task force, FBI, Narcotics Bureau, IRS, all the other agencies. FBI really didn't care to belong, but he brought Hoover along as best he could. He reorganized the focus of the IRS from being just mere tax collectors into being an investigative agency. He hired 60 new lawyers for his own tax division in the Justice Department. Perhaps one of the keys was the head of the criminal division was a guy named Jack Miller. Miller was a dedicated Republican, had never practiced criminal law, didn't know anything about criminal law, but he did know Hoffa. He'd been one of the monitors that the court had appointed to monitor the Teamsters' activities for 2 years in 59 and 60. He knew Hoffa and he knew the Teamsters, and he was going to head the criminal division. Bobby also hired a guy by the name of Walter Sheridan. You'll hear more about Walter Sheridan later on. Walter Sheridan was the chief investigator of the McClellan Committee. He was kind of a computer. He was a detail guy. No telling what he would do in the age of computers, but he was like to look into the relationships between the various parties in the Teamsters transactions. And he was charged with organizing a group to follow up on the McClellan leads and see whether criminal actions could be brought against the Teamsters. As part of that, he was to hire young lawyers. James Neal came to his attention. Neal was practicing in D.C. at that time. He hadn't been out of law school 5 years. Another guy, Charlie Schaffer, hadn't been out of law school 5 years, but he was recommended to Sheridan. He was hired along with many others. So the focus was on Hoffa. The Sheridan group was called the Get Hoffa Squad, although he didn't like to call it the Hoffa Squad or Get Hoffa Squad, because his moles in the Teamsters Union told him there were 2 moles in the Justice Department, so he didn't like to identify any of the kind of things that they were doing. Within a month of Neal and Schaffer being hired, February of '62, they were sent to Nashville to start working up the test fleet case. By the end of December that year, December 1961, there were 24 grand juries across the country looking into Hoffa and the Teamsters. They were cranking up. Test fleet, what was it? Well, simply stated, it was a scam. It's illegal to get money to Jimmy Hoffa. In 1947, a company called Commercial Carriers, Inc., a car hauling company in Michigan, was faced with a wildcat strike by its Teamster drivers. They went to Hoffa and said, "Can you give us some help?" Hoffa says, "Yeah." He talks to the driver, said, "Look, you got a wildcat strike here. You've got no protection in the law. You're going to get sued individually. You're all going to get ripped off. You're going to get destroyed." The ripping off came when they said, "Okay, we'll go back to work." They all lost their seniority, and the 7 organizers lost their jobs. Hoffa, though, got a deal. The deal was Commercial Carriers had their lawyers charter a company here in Nashville called Test Fleet. Test Fleet was going to be a commercial carrier too. It was going to buy 10 trucks, and then was going to lease them to commercial carriers to carry Cadillacs to distribution points. Cadillac was the most lucrative business. So for 10 years they did that. The stock was issued to Mrs. Hoffa and to his vice president, Burt Brennan's wives, in their maiden names, and they operated for about 10 years. The existence of Test Fleet was organized, by the way, about 10 days after the passage of the Taft-Hartley Act, which was a modification of the Wagner Act. But one of the provisions of the Taft-Hartley Act was that it prohibited employers from giving any money or anything of value to representatives of their employees, and vice versa. Representative employees could not receive anything from employers. The penalty was a misdemeanor, is all it was. 1 year in prison, $10,000 fine. There's a typo. So it wasn't a big deal, but it came up in 54 and one earlier here, and it came up in 57. Hoffa testified about it at length. Didn't know anything about it. It's my wife's company. It's her money. I don't know anything about it. That sort of stuff. But they reported it. He and the commercial carrier lawyers did all the reporting you're supposed to do, ICC, IRS. Finally, they divested themselves and closed the operation down in 1958. So why in the world are they looking at Test Fleet after all this? John J. Hooker, for example, had looked at it at Bobby Kennedy's request and said, "What do you think?" He said, "I think it's a loser." Bobby says, "I don't care. I'm going to prosecute it anyway. You got to be somebody to, if you're not going to do it, who do you want to do it?" He said, "Well, you got Neil over here in the Get Hoffa unit, see if he'll do it." So that's kind of that's the story about how Neil got involved in that. But the Test Fleet situation, in Bobby's eyes and others, it was emblematic of the corruption of Jimmy Hoffa, who would line his pockets and his buddies' pockets illegally at the expense of his members. It also showed that there was nothing too small for Bobby Kennedy if he thought he had a chance to go after Jimmy Hoffa and the Teamsters. And thirdly, Jim Neal thought he'd discovered some additional evidence during the grand jury process, so they thought they had a better case than they had originally. The indictment came down in May of '62, 2 counts, conspiracy to violate the Taft-Hartley Act, and the second count receiving the actual proceeds from commercial carriers. Hoffa became the only defendant when commercial carriers pleaded nolo and got out of the case. Cecil Branstetter represented Hoffa. He had represented Local 327, and he represented Hoffa through pretrial motions up until early September, when he withdrew and Tommy Osborne was chosen to replace him. Case was set for trial on the 22nd of October of '62. So moving right along. Indictment in May, trial in October. Shortly after Osborne was hired, about a week after, 2 guys come to town. One guy named Weiss and another one named Buster Bell. They were known as improvers. Improvers were the name that Edward Bennett Williams, Hoffa's longtime lawyer and Teamsters lawyer, gave to some of the Hoffa operatives. They would help out in some of these lawsuits and cases that he had, and they would turn they would improve misdemeanors into felonies. So this was the first wave of the helpers coming to town. Buster was a member of the International Vice President of the International Longshoremen's Union. Weiss was under indictment for extortion in Newark and waiting his trial up there. In a major development, another week after that, late September, Sheridan gets a call that a fellow by the name of Edward Grady Parton wanted to talk to the Justice Department. He had a matter of national security he wanted to talk about. Edward Grady Parton was the president of Local Union 5 in Baton Rouge. He was currently in jail. He had some issues that he had to deal with. One was first-degree manslaughter in Alabama, kidnapping in Louisiana, and a 26 federal indictment for stealing union money and altering his records of his members. He needed to talk to somebody. So he got with Sheridan. The national security issue was he'd been to see Hoffa in June, or July of that year, 62, and Hoffa alluded to the fact that there may have been some plot to kill Bobby Kennedy. He said, something's got to be done about Kennedy. He's got to go. He drives around town by himself in a convertible. He swims by himself at Hickory Hill. The FBI didn't want to have anything to do with Parton. It took 2 lie detector tests. He failed the first one. But finally, Sheridan became comfortable with him and said, I'd like to see what he can do for us. And the FBI says, okay, he's your guy. We'll do some backup, whatever you want, but he's your guy. They taped 2 phone calls between Parton and Hoffa on the 8th and 18th of October, a few days before trial. He says, Jimmy, I've got some problems. I need to come talk to you. Jimmy says, I'll be in Nashville on the 22nd. Can you come by then? He says, yeah. And he does. The issue becomes, in the role of Edward Graydon Parton becomes key, because was he there because Hoffa invited him or wanted to see him, or was he there incidentally and then Hoffa asked him to stay, or was he a plant by the government, an impermissible plant? Probably both. Hoffa did ask him to stay throughout the trial, and he was there off and on through the trial. Also, John said Kennedy and the folks were suspicious always of jury tampering and all these other cases where Hoffa had been involved, and they just thought that we'll just keep looking for this. We're going to catch him doing it one of these days. Parton came to Nashville. He was given a code name and given a phone number to contact Sheridan. The trial started on the 22nd of October and lasted about 9 weeks. The trial's day was only 9 to 1. Judge Miller had a heart condition, and that left some time for the lawyers to get ready for the next day, and it left time for other people to do all kinds of other stuff with respect to the trial. And that started, aside from the improvers, on October 19th, some new players came in on the scene. In addition to the improvers, they came back into town on the 19th. Also on that day, a guy named Larry Campbell, who was a business agent at Local 219 in Detroit, Hoffa's home local, set up shop in Louisville. He was a African-American, lived in Nashville, had contacts here, and it was reasonable to assume that on the jury panel there might be some African-American members. Turns out that there were 2. So he's in place working his contacts, starting to work his contacts in Nashville. Also that day, a guy named Nick Tweel came to town. Nick was from Huntington, West Virginia. He was in the vending machine business. He wanted to expand his business, and he needed some money. He, through various contacts, came in contact, met with one of the Dorfmans. There was a father-son team in Chicago who handled the pension plans and the insurance programs, all kinds of stuff for the Teamsters, major players. And he was negotiating, talking with Mr. Dorfman about his loan. And Mr. Dorfman evidently had created repayment plans and asked Mr. Tweel to come help with the jury. And Mr. Tweel brought 3 guys from Huntington, West Virginia. 2 of them were policemen on the Huntington Police Department. The other one was a private detective. Parton comes to town the night of October 22nd. He runs into Tweel and Dorfman, introduced to them. He sees Hoffa that night. He says, I met this guy Tweel. I know Dorfman, but who's this Tweel guy? Hoffa says, he's down here to help me with the jury. We're trying to get to 1 or 2 jurors, take our chances and see what happens. Parton calls Sheridan that very night and says they're fixing to get to the jury. Also the night of the 22nd, that was the first trial day, nothing but arguments on that day. That was the night that Jack Kennedy spoke to the country about the Cuban Missile Crisis and the imminent prospect of nuclear war within days. Bobby had been working with him, of course, you know, hand in glove for many days prior to that. Notwithstanding that, Bobby got on the phone that night, called Sheridan, said, what's going on in Nashville? I said, well, they're going to pick jury tomorrow. So when are you going down there? He said, Neil doesn't want me down here until after the jury's picked. Bobby says, get down there tonight. So Sheridan goes down there, comes down here, and begins to meet with Parton. Jury selection starts on the 23rd. Before it gets started, one of the women contacted Kenneth Harwell, who is the actual U.S. attorney here, and said to Mr. Harwell, somebody from the Nashville Banner called me and said their name was Allen and wanted to know what I thought about Jimmy Hoffa and the Teamsters. Mr. Harwell reports that to the judge, Judge Miller. Judge Miller speaks to the panel. Have any of the rest of you received calls? And about 10 hands go up, and they're all excused. John Branham, I don't know if John's here, but John Branham, a lawyer here in town, his mother was one of those. Judge Campbell heard the story and said, well, you're still in Nashville if your mother was on a Hoffa jury. It was a problem. That was very public dismissal of these jurors, and there was real concern that there might be a mistrial. The word got out, publicity got out. Tennessee, of course, was allied with Siegenthaler, was allied with Bobby, didn't want to rock the boat, so they were quiet. Jimmy Stallman, who owned the Banner, was livid. He didn't have a reporter named Allen, and his newspaper and his reputation was being besmirched. And he was going to tell the world about it, and he was going to try and find Mr. Allen. The missile crisis was still going on. Bobby Kennedy's meeting with the Russian ambassador in some restaurant in D.C. He's deep in the middle of all that. But he finds time to call Jimmy Stallman to try and talk him out of writing anything about this story. Stallman doesn't like Kennedy. Hell with you. He writes a story, front page, which is kind of his want, and offering a reward if somebody could track down Mr. Allen. On the 23rd, they do manage to pick 3 jurors. One of them is named James Tippin. That night, Parton calls Sheridan and says, I was talking to Hoffa, and I need to go back to Baton Rouge, and Hoffa says, hang around for a while. I may need for you to pass something for me. And Hoffa hits his back pocket. And, okay. Well, the next morning, Mr. Tippins reports to the judge that his neighbor, Red Medlin, had offered him $10,000 to vote to acquit Hoffa, if he would do that, which kind of helped the bona fides from Parton, because he told him about this the night before Tippins came forward. Tippins is dismissed. Miller calls in Hoffa and the lawyers and tells them what's happened. He says, I don't know where this is coming from, but it's going to stop. There's nothing more going to happen along this line. I'm just relieved there are no lawyers involved. A couple days later, on the 27th of October, Ewing King, who was the president of Local 327 here, he tells Parton, rather, that he's got some contacts. One of the jurors, woman, is married to a highway patrolman, and he knows a guy that knows the highway patrolman, and they're going to go through the highway patrolman and maybe get to the wife and see what they can do for her, what she can do for them. This is brought to Miller's attention. He okayed surveillance of King by the FBI from then on, but specifically not any surveillance of Hoffa, the jurors, or any of the lawyers. This is 3 potential attempts, or budding attempts, and the government hadn't even opened its proof yet. They're still selecting jurors. Hoffa complains about King dragging his heels and not getting to the patrolman. Finally, in the middle of the night, the weekend of October 17th, 18th, they follow King, the FBI follows King after he switches cars with somebody, down to Woodbury, where he meets the Teamster member. The highway patrolman's there. The Teamster member's got one of the all-time great names, Mutt Pitts was his name. Mutt sets up this meeting. They follow King back to Nashville. The case started, the proof started on the 30th. It didn't start out well for the government. Jim Neal's first witness told him about 15 minutes before the trial starts, basically, yo, Jim, I'll be taking the 5th today. And this was just the guy that filed the charter. I mean, it's no major figure, but kind of get the flavor of things coming down the pike. About a week after that, Hoffa tells Pardon, we've got a black juror in our back pocket. My business agent from Detroit set this all up. So we're going great guns here. That's the fourth try. The case plods along, literally. It's not well covered in the press. There are lots of other things going on in Nashville. The Cuban Missile Crisis was going on, for example. That you had Loser and Fulton running against each other for Congress. You had Riley and Clifford Allen running against each other for mayor. And so there were other things going on. The key thing that they had the government wanted to prove was that money went from the dividends given to Ms. Hoffa and Ms. Brennan and got to Hoffa. And they didn't get the proof about that until the 26th of November, when Hoffa's former CPA and his lawyer testified. Now, they testified not about confidences or strategies or anything they'd been told. They simply testified about what they did. That was the dodge. For example, the lawyer said, I got a dividend check from Ms. Hoffa. I cashed it and wrote a check to Mr. Hoffa. The story goes he went out in the hall after break. Hoffa fired him right there on the spot. Said, don't forget the $75,000 you owe me. He went home and disconnected his phone, and presumably didn't start his car for the next several weeks. While the jury was out on November 5th, people, both sides, were sitting around shuffling papers waiting for something to happen. And a fellow walks into the courtroom, walks down the aisle into the swinging doors, pulls out, as Neil described it, the biggest gun I've ever seen, and starts firing at Hoffa. Turns out it's a pellet gun. And Hoffa throws his hands up like this, charges the fellow, hits him with one blow, and knocks him down. He's hauled out. Hoffa files an oral motion for a mistrial. Miller says, put it in writing. Neil takes that opportunity to submit a motion to the court to exclude Ms. Pascal, the highway patrolman's wife. There's a hearing the next day, and she's excused. Hoffa's motion for mistrial is denied on the 10th. Hoffa says that the experience was such shock, stress, and strain that he couldn't effectively communicate with his lawyers. Judge Miller basically said, what the? I saw the whole thing. The motion's utterly groundless, if not fantastic. Hoffa takes a stand on the 14th, testifies, cross-examined at length. Sheridan says, though, he's an impressive, tough, testy witness, and it'll be up to the jury to decide his credibility. At the end of the proof, Neil files a motion to exclude the black juror, Brayton Fields. This was touchy, because the only evidence they had was Parton's testimony, and if he came out, he'd be revealed. What are you going to do? Well, talk to the highest levels of the Department of Justice and what they decided to do, roll the dice. Had Parton do an affidavit, file it with the motion under seal, and see what Miller would do with it. Miller read the motion, opened the envelope, read the affidavit, puts it back, doesn't show it to the defense, and excludes Fields. Fields didn't know why he was being excluded. The jury finally goes out on the 21st of December after a 56-page charge. They come back after 17 hours of deliberation, and they're hopelessly hung. And Miller says, I've got to declare a mistrial. I hate to do that. Turns out later on, we found interviewing jurors, it was 7-5 for acquittal. Had been 8-4 for acquittal. You could hear, according to Sharon, you could hear the audible sigh of relief from the table next door of the defense. And but Miller says, not so fast. Got one thing to do before we leave. He reads the statement, which is in your materials. The indictment is in your materials, too. He tells the jury what happened, why they were sequestered, about the attempts to reach the two jurors, the people they'd been sitting with for weeks and weeks. All of a sudden, they disappeared. What happened to them? And he says, I'm calling for a grand jury to convene right after the first year to look into these issues. The U.S. Attorney is going to give all the evidence they have, and I'm releasing the material from this hearing, these closed hearings that we had. So that the misdemeanor was morphine, into a felony. The grand jury was convened right after the first of the year. In early February, there was a hearing, meeting at DOJ about what to do with Parton, how were they going to use him, and was there a Sixth Amendment issue? Archibald Cox determined he'd be comfortable arguing the case before the Supreme Court, so they went forward. In April, John Hooker was hired to work with Neal to represent the government in prosecuting the new case. Hoffa was indicted in May on 5 counts. That same day, conspiracy plus 5 counts, and that same day, separate indictment indicted 3 other people. So at the end of the day, you had 7 counts of substantive jury tampering plus a conspiracy. Judge Miller that summer recused himself. Judge Gray took his place. And on October 14th, the jury panel for Judge Gray's court, the Hoffa jury tampering trial panel, was sworn in, and that leads to Mr. Sanders and Mr. Yarbrough.
Yeah, I knew Tommy Osborne very well. I had some really emotional circumstances with Tommy. He was a person that I greatly admired his talent. He had great talent, and he and I were pals. He was also a friend of my father. And I remember very vividly that he came to see me in 1961 or 2, early, whatever, have to place the date, because he had been contacted by Jimmy Hoffa to represent him. I had lived at Bobby's house for about 9 months and read all the files on Jimmy Hoffa and recommended against the Hoffa case. It infuriated Bobby. But he finally agreed that, okay, if you're not going to do it, you're not going to do it, get me a lawyer. And that's how Jim Neal got involved in it. I called up Jim Neal, who sat next to me in law school, along with Tommy Shriver and George Barrett, and Jim Neal and I were all in the same class, and called up Neal and said, the Attorney General's asked me to find him a lawyer, and what about you? And Jim then met with Bobby and talked it over, and finally they agreed to do it. And Bobby absolutely thought that Jimmy Hoffa was a menace to America. He thought that the power to take those trucks and shut down the food service for cities was awesome, and he thought Jimmy Hoffa was a bad man and was a dishonest man, and so he wanted to prosecute him, and was determined to, and did. And of course he did employ Neal. They then had a trial here in Nashville, and ultimately Jimmy Hoffa fixed the jury. And Tommy Osborne, unfortunately, was the man involved in it, and was ultimately indicted and sent to the penitentiary about it. After I left Bobby's house and came back to practice law and live in Nashville, Tommy Osborne came to see me before the Hoffa trial, and I said that he had been contacted by Hoffa and that Hoffa wanted to employ him as a local counsel. And I said, Tommy, don't do that. You'll regret that. Bobby he's after this fella, and he's going to get him. And Hoffa's going to fix the jury. Mark my word, Tommy. He's going to fix this jury when Bobby turns the full heat of the federal FBI on him. He's going to fix this jury. And Tommy, I remember we were sitting. I had a law office with a fireplace in it, and on Union Street there, he got up out of his chair. He said, "Well, you don't think I'd fix it, do you?" I said, "Certainly not, but I'm telling you, Hoffa's going to fix it, and when he does, you're going to get caught. And you're the local man here. It'll end up embarrassing you. Don't do it." Anyway, to make a long story short, he did it. He took the case, and then, God forbid, he became the agent of the fix, and ultimately went to the penitentiary about it. Then after he fixed the jury, Bobby called me back and said, "Now, will you try the jury tampering case?" I said, "Bobby, I told you I'm not trying Hoffa. I'm not going to do that. But if you really want to put him in the penitentiary, which I know you do, get my papa." And so he got John J. Hooker Sr., and he and Jim Neal went to Chattanooga and prosecuted Hoffa and convicted him. Tommy Osborne who was a part of that team, ultimately, and had been involved in the fix, Bobby decided he wanted to prosecute Osborne. My father came up to my law office one afternoon and said, Bobby wants, this was after the conviction of Hoffa, said Bobby wants me to prosecute Tommy Osborne. And I think I said, Papa, don't do that. You and Tommy Osborne have been on these cruises together. You drunk a lot of whiskey together. You're great pals. Don't do that. I never will forget my father saying, son, he tampered with the wheels of justice, the temple of justice. That's where I'm supposed to, that's where I live, in the temple of justice. And I'm going to do it. And he did it, and he prosecuted Hoffa and sent him penitentiary. A few years later, after he went to penitentiary, I had run for governor. I was running for governor in 1996. I got home one night, and there was an envelope on my pillow, and it was a letter from Tommy Osborne, written in his long hand, and $100 in cash. And it said, Dear John Jay, with all my heart, I want you to be governor. I quit smoking to save this money. And he sent me $100. A few years later, after he got out of the penitentiary, I got a call one afternoon. It was my father. And he said, this is the worst day of my life. I said, what's the problem, Papa? He said, Tommy Osborne's killed himself. I feel like it's my fault. I said, Papa. I went and spent the afternoon with him. Tommy Osborne. I knew him. I loved him. He was so talented. It was such a sad circumstance.
A lot of sadness surrounds a case like this, and we are trying to be objective and fair in our dealing with it. My pal Jim Sanders and I were in the second year of law school at Vanderbilt 47 years ago, the fall of 1968.
You sure about that year?
I'm pretty sure. Found it on the internet. And by the way, we're so enthusiastic about history that we use historical pictures of ourselves. But we're taking a course called Criminal Procedure. There was a nickname for that course. You remember what it was?
Hoffa 101.
Absolutely, because it was taught by none other than the famous prosecutor of Jimmy Hoffa, James F. Neal. And he talked about Hoffa almost every time we met class. And of course, we loved it because these were war stories. These were tales of real trials in real courts. It was not like, reading a case book and hearing the dry recitation of case law. So it was quite an inspiration, and led you to have a fairly long association with the gentleman.
Right. I think that was the start of it. And one of the most fun things about the course were the stories that Jim told that didn't have any damn thing to do with criminal procedure. His favorite story was that every day when he went to court, usually Hoffa had beat him into the courtroom, and Hoffa was sitting at the table. And as Jim walked in, Hoffa under the table would go every day.
Can we put a fuzzy ball on that or something?
I checked with the committee. They said it was okay.
Okay, good.
They were a lot alike. Jim had a grudging and limited respect for Hoffa. The similarities were pretty obvious. Both were short and stocky. John, that's the perfect build.
For what?
For people.
Oh.
They were both extremely aggressive. They were charismatic. They were courageous. The story about Hoffa and the pellet gun thing is amazing because Hoffa didn't know that was a pellet gun. He charged the guy. So it was an interesting class with a lot of interesting stories. But the thing that strikes me, and I'll ask Ed, do you ever remember Jim Neal in those classes telling a story about Tommy Osborne?
Never did.
It was, and you just heard why in a way. Everybody that was involved with that, Jim Neal, Judge Miller, Judge Gray, Cecil Brandstetter, John J. Hooker Jr. Nobody wanted to talk about it. Jim never talked about it. Judge Gray didn't want to talk about it. Judge Miller didn't want to talk about it. It was this great, awful tragedy that is still with us today.
One of the reasons that we wanted this program to be an ethics presentation in addition to regular CLE was that there was a tremendous choice made in the course of representation of Jimmy Hoffa in the test fleet case that most people don't know about. So what we're going to do now is just tell you a little bit about the life and times of ZT Tommy Osborne. And we're going to tell the good with the bad, and we're going to try to be fair to everyone. But we feel like the only important thing to do here is to tell the truth. And we're trying very hard to do that. On Monday, February 2nd, 1970, the weather in Nashville was cool and wet, but by the end of the day, the weather had gotten much worse, and it turned colder, and a light snow began to fall. Jim Neal's friend and fellow classmate, John Hollins, came home from work at the usual time, and as he passed Beacon Drive on the way home in Green Hills, he noticed an ambulance and a number of police cars with lights flashing just down the street. Hollins knew that this was the home of Tommy Osborne. When he entered the house and turned on the evening news, Hollins learned that Osborne's body had been found in his garage, dead from a single gunshot wound. This was the last moment in the saga of Tommy Osborne, a young man who in 1946 had joined the Nashville Bar Association and began a meteoric rise culminating in the spring of 1962 when he, as one of the lead counsel in the Baker versus Carr decision, enjoyed the celebration that was throughout the Nashville Bar, the decision from the Warren Court that one man, one vote would allow the courts to enter the political thicket and say that reapportionment of the legislature could in fact be determined by the court system in this country, something that had been fought both at the state and federal level for a number of years. And of course that was the subject of our presentation 3 years ago. So Osborne would, there'd be no end to his glory. He was honored by the Bar Association. There was a lot of talk about his rise in the Bar Association. In fact, I went back and looked at Dave Rutherford's book and discovered that Tommy Osborne was actually elected to the board of the Bar Association 3 times. First in 1947, just a year after he joined the bar, and then in 1954 he was elected again and was first vice president in 1956. And back in those days, similar to my experience in the 80s, the first vice president typically was the second highest vote getter for the election of the president. And then in 62, he was elected to the board the 3rd time, and it was pretty much assumed, I think, at that point, that he would rise to the position of president when it came his time, which would have been at the end of 1963. The sad part is, of course, that in 1963, he would be indicted for jury tampering and disbarred by the federal court because of what happened, and we'll tell you a little bit more about that in a moment. And he was obviously never president of the Bar Association, lost his license to practice law, and ultimately killed himself. But during his career, you would have to say that Tommy Osborne was privileged to practice with some of the city's great lawyers. His 3 mentors were Dick Lansden, Raymond Denny, and Jack Norman Sr. Pretty good, huh? He practiced law with the Lansden Group. He was in the Ben West legal department for a while. He also practiced with Harris Gilbert at what later became the firm of Barksdale, Wally, Gilbert, and Frank. And then just before he got involved in the Test Fleet case, he went over to 3rd Avenue and started practicing law with Raymond Denny and Mr. Lefkowitz, and that was the firm of Denny, Lefkowitz, and Osborne, and that's where he was when all of this stuff took place. Now the story is, and we're pretty sure it's true, we know that various other people that lived during that period have confirmed at least that Mr. Norman was the one who recommended Tommy to Jimmy Hoffa, but the tale is that Hoffa had called Norman and asked him to represent him. And as Jack Sr. is sitting there at his office on 3rd Avenue, he's able to look out the window of his office onto the street, and he sees Tommy Osborne walking up 3rd toward his office, which is right across the street. And just at that moment says, well, why don't you hire Tommy Osborne? He's one of the finest lawyers in Nashville, and he'd be a good local counsel for you. And that's actually how it probably happened, or something very similar. The irony about some of this stuff is not lost on us, because there's Norman getting Tommy Osborne, one of the leading lawyers in Nashville, into a case which will lead to his undoing. And then one of Mr. Norman's great friends and great adversaries, Mr. Hooker Sr., will be the prosecutor. So it's amazing. Nowadays, we don't think of how small the Nashville legal community was at that time. Unquestionably, the high point of Osborne's career came in had when he participated in the second oral argument in the U.S. Supreme Court in Baker versus Carr. And this is the incident, where Felix Frankfurter, who had been the author of Colegrove versus Green, the decision that said you could not get into the political thicket, was questioning Osborne and saying, well, even if we adopt your argument today, as soon as the numbers change, you'll be back here, won't you? And Tommy Osborne said, well, if employed to come. And the whole room burst out in laughter. And many people think that was the turning point in the argument. Of course, there were lots of other things going on. I'll conclude with this. Osborne was enthusiastic and inventive in his defense of Jimmy Hoffa, always a champion of the underdog and taking the populist approach. Osborne may have been guilty of identifying too much with his client. One example of this was during the Test Fleet trial, when James Tippin, and you heard Frank talk about Tippin a moment ago, one of the Test Fleet jurors told Judge Miller that he had been offered $10,000 in $100 bills to vote for acquittal. And Osborne responded that was probably crackpots and do-gooders who were doing that. This seemed a little disingenuous because obviously at that time most people knew that Hoffa had been tried 4 other times, and there had been allegations of jury tampering in several of those trials. We don't know for sure whether jury tampering actually occurred in the Test Fleet trial, but certainly the implication is there. Let's now see what Harris Gilbert, the good friend of Tommy Osborne, had to say about Tommy's character and his personality.
He was a lawyer that loved a challenge. Tommy once said it to me, I'd rather be riding a horse like Galahadian, which was 101 shot and won the Kentucky Derby, like maybe 1940, 41, than riding the horse that's a 2-to-1 favorite. I want to do something that nobody says can be done, and this is the case that I think I can do it. And, it was great to see somebody who wasn't at the time concerned with how much he was going to make out of it, or, well, he did want to have the funds necessary for proper representation and produce the documents and all that, but he was bright. He had a great gift of speech. He was good at making short, pithy comments. He could do more with a jury than I, at that time, had seen with other lawyers. He knew how to make it quick, light, deliberate, no excess. Tom Osborne, when the state Supreme Court rendered its decision, he made a statement in the newspaper to a newspaper reporter, which basically said the Supreme Court was dead wrong and why couldn't they enforce the Constitution. And he was disbarred on the spot. It had not been announced. He was disbarred by the Supreme Court for doing that. And luckily he had a friend who was, at that time, a powerful man at the Supreme Court. He got him to reconsider it, and they said they accepted Osborne's apology for being intemperate about it. Dick Lanston was the clerk of the court. Not Dick Lanston, Dave Lanston, his brother, was the clerk of the Supreme Court, and he and Tommy were very close. And Tommy just lost his cool. He said, the motto at the Supreme Court is, even though the heavens may fall, justice will be done. I believe that was the translation. He says they can't follow the motto that's up there above the Supreme Court.
He was talking about the Supreme Court. Original disbarment was the Tennessee Supreme Court, not the U.S. Supreme Court. What I'd like to do is go through very quickly what I consider to be the critical evidence in this case. And I guess before I do that, I want to make it clear that the original jury tampering indictment, which came down in May of '63, did not include Tommy Osborne. That was for alleged jury tampering in the Tess Fleet case. It was during the pendency of the trial to be held in Nashville in front of Judge Gray for that jury tampering that the events we're going to talk about occurred. But before you get to that, and hearkening back to something that Frank was talking about, Cecil Brandstetter withdrew or moved to withdraw from the defense of Hoffa in the jury tampering case in roughly September of 1963. In about October, Judge Gray granted that motion. And, no, I'm sorry, I've got my times wrong. 62 Tess Fleet, Cecil Brandstetter moves to withdraw. Trial is set for October 22nd. The motion to withdraw is granted. So in October, on or about October 1st, Tommy Osborne takes over for Cecil Brandstetter. As you heard from Frank, the jury was sworn on October the 14th, 1962. And Mr. Brandstetter later told of a meeting that he had. He was invited to the first defense meeting after his withdrawal to discuss the Tess Fleet defense. And instead of there being a group of lawyers around, when Mr. Brandstetter got there, there was the group that Frank described. There was Nicholas Tweel and the two people from West Virginia. There were some longshoremen from New York, and there was Bob Vick. And what they talked about was not the defense of the case, but they were talking about jurors they knew and how to be contacted. And Mr. Brandstetter was absolutely horrified. And on the next day, he takes Tommy down to the street and says, "What I heard yesterday goes well beyond what is appropriate and legal in jury investigation, Tommy. And you should know the government's probably bugging you anyway." And Mr. Osborne's response was, "They're doing anything and everything in this prosecution. We're fighting fire with fire, and that's all." Next, you've heard the recitation of what happened during the Tess Fleet case. In the Tess Fleet case, on 3 occasions, there were problems brought to the court's attention. There was a hearing outside the presence of the jury involving Mr. Hoffa and his lawyers, in which there was evidence that improper contacts had been made with this jury. And obviously, Judge Miller was upset at every single one of those. So by the time you get to this next year, to the jury tampering trial, you have this history of 3 different times, plus the one that wasn't disclosed to them, Juror Fields, that occurred during the course of the Tess Fleet case. After the jury hung, and as Frank told you, Judge Miller then surprises everybody in the courtroom and in the Nashville legal community. Instead of thanking the jury for its service, goes into an explanation of all the problems that have occurred during the course of the Tess Fleet trial and refers the case officially and on the record to the Department of Justice for investigation of jury tampering. So all of this is prelude to the events following the indictment of Mr. Hoffa. And so what happens then is in November of '63, Sheridan is contacted by Bob Vick, the same guy that was in the room the year before when Mr. Brandstedter's there. And Bob Vick says, "I want to talk to you about jury tampering by Tommy Osborne." And they wrestle with that, the prosecutors and Sheridan, and they decide, okay, we're going to get an affidavit from Vick. And so affidavit is gotten. They decided in an abundance of caution, not because it was legally required, that they were going to send Vick in with a recorder on him, but they wanted a warrant. So they took to Judge Miller, who was not sitting on the jury tampering case. Judge Gray was doing that. They went to Judge Miller. They got a warrant for this eavesdropping. So Vic goes in on November the 8th. That's a Friday. He goes to Mr. Osborne's office. He has a recorder in the middle of his back. He spends a little bit of time in there. He comes back out. The agents say, "How did it go?" He said, "He told me that he wanted me to give Juror Elliott $5,000 if he got on the jury and $5,000 if there was a hung jury or an acquittal in the case." Oddly enough, that jibes with the $10,000 amount that was involved in all the test fleet evidence. They then go to the offices, they pull the tape recorder out, and the tape is unraveled. You can't hear anything but the introduction. So then, believe it or not, they decide, we'll just send him back in. So he goes back in on Saturday, and Mr. Osborne is not there, but they have a telephone conversation, and they agree they're going to meet on the following Monday, November the 11th. So he goes back in with a new tape recorder and a new tape on November the 8th, and they have this conversation, and the tape works. And that tape recording then becomes the centerpiece for the entire indictment, disbarment, prosecution, conviction of Tommy Osborne. And it's so important that it was the centerpiece of Mr. Hooker Sr.'s closing argument in the trial, and it was published in full by both the Sixth Circuit and by the United States Supreme Court in both of the Osborne appeals. Now, after...
You want to play it? You want to play it?
Yeah, let's play it.
Jody, can we just play that now?
Did you talk to him?
Yeah. I went down to Springfield Saturday morning.
Elliot?
Elliot.
Is there any chance in the world that he would report you?
That he will report me to the FBI?
Mm-hmm.
Well, of course there's always a chance. But I wouldn't have got into it if I thought it was very, very great. So he got to talking about the last Hoffa case being hung, you know, and some guy refusing $10,000 to hang it, see? And he says, the guy was crazy. He should have took it, you know, and so we talked about it, and just discreetly, you know, and of course I'm really playing things slow. That's the reason I asked if you wanted a lawyer down there to handle it or just wanted me to handle it, because I'm going to play it easy.
The less people, the better.
That's right. Well, I'm going to play it slow and easy myself. And anyway, we talked about something about 5,000 now and 5,000 later, see? So he did. He brought up 5,000 and see, and talking about how they pay it off and things like that. I don't know whether he suspected why I was there or not, because I don't just drop out of the blue and visit him socially. You know, we're friends, close and kin, cousins, but I don't ordinarily just, we don't fraternize, you know, and so he seemed very receptive for, to hang the thing for 5 now and 5 later. Now, I thought I would report back to you and see what they say.
That's fine. The thing to do is set it up for a point later, so you won't be running back and forth.
Yeah.
Then tell him it's a deal.
It's what?
That it's a deal. What we'll have to do when it gets down to the trial date, when we know the date, so tomorrow, for example, if the Supreme Court rules against us, well, within a week we'll know when the trial comes, then he has to be certain that when he gets on, he's got to know that he'll just be talking to you and nobody else. All right, so we'll leave it up to you. The only thing to do would be to tell him, in other words, your next contact with him would be to tell him that if he wants the deal, he's got it.
Okay.
The thing it depends on is him being accepted by the jury. If the government challenges him, then there'll be no deal.
All right. If he is seated.
If he is seated.
He can expect 5,000 then.
Immediately.
Immediately, and then 5,000 when it's hung. Is that right?
All the way now.
Oh, he's got to stay all the way?
All the way.
No swing? You don't want him to swing like we discussed once before? You want him...
Of course. He could be guided by his own, well, that always leaves a question. The thing to do is just stick with the crowd. The way we'll look better and maybe not have to go for another trial is if we get a pretty good count.
Oh, now, I'm going to play it just like you told me previously, to reassure him and keep him from getting panicky, you know. I have reason to believe that he won't be alone, you know.
You assured him of that, 100%.
And to keep any fears down that he might have, see?
Tell him there'll be at least 2 others with him. We'll keep it secret. The way to keep it safe is that nobody knows about it but you and me. Where could they ever go?
That tape recording was taken to both judges, and both judges immediately called for a meeting in chambers with Mr. Osborne. And they asked Mr. Osborne some questions going to whether he knew anything about any efforts to contact any jurors. And there was a series of about 3 questions. He answered all of them no. They then gave him an order to show cause why he should not be disbarred and set a hearing for the 25th of November. The day after that, Mr. Norman was contacted immediately. Mr. Norman and Mr. Osborne go back to Judge Gray. Judge Miller had gone back to a judicial conference in New York. They go to Judge Gray and basically ask, what's the evidence? And Judge Gray calls a court reporter in and recites to them exactly what the evidence is. And then on the 19th, Mr. Osborne comes back in with Mr. Norman and says, I don't want a show cause hearing. Let's have it right now. Let me make a statement. He makes a statement which suggests that he was entrapped and it was Vic's idea and that Vic was the aggressor in the deal. And the judges ask him, do you want, Mr. Vic is available, do you want to cross-examine him? Do you want to cross-examine any of the government witnesses? He says, no, I do not. I'll stand on my statement. And they immediately disbar him. And on the next day, the 20th, Judge Miller puts down the opinion supporting the disbarment from the federal bar.
Now, you have some experience with Judge Miller and Judge Gray, didn't you?
I did. I spent more time with Judge Gray than Judge Miller, and one of the things that I think is the most significant as I look back on this, and I look around the room, there are not many people in here who remember Judge Miller or knew Judge Miller, but I will tell you that Judge Miller was the most conservative politically and in bearing on the bench and in writing of almost any judge I ever met. And he didn't throw words around. He was very careful with his language. And the capper for me is this paragraph on page 8 of the memorandum. Based upon the evidence presented at the hearing, including the statements and answers made by the respondent, Mr. Osborne, and a careful observation of his manner and demeanor at the time his various statements and answers were made and given, the following findings and conclusions appear to the court to be conclusively and inescapably established. Judge Miller was incensed. And that's the best example of what a tragedy this was.
A lot of people wonder, why did Tommy Osborne, someone with such a promising career, born the same year as Cecil Branstetter, 1920, both rising stars. Cecil obviously went on to have a fabulous legal career and just passed away a little over a year ago. But Tommy Osborne made a fatal decision. He apparently, even though his father was a minister in Kentucky, was not aware of the biblical truth that evil company corrupts good habits. And he came under the influence of Jimmy Hoffa, a man whose evil he probably was not even acquainted with. And we think, after analyzing it, that there were three main temptations. Number one was the fee. The $50,000 retainer fee was a lot of money in 1962. Number two was the idea of the populist cause, taking the side of the downtrodden, the underdog. Even though Hoffa was obviously a very important and wealthy man, he was still seen as the underdog against the federal government. But probably the most telling of all of the theories is the one that says that Osborne simply became over-identified with his client. And he felt, as Jim said, that they were fighting fire with fire. The problem there is that the fire that the federal government had was legitimate, and the fire that they chose to use was clearly illegal. Now, we could go into a long analysis of how many ethical rules were violated here, but that's not a close question, and there are some materials in our handout that can help you with that if you want to dig deeper. But I'm looking at the clock and Mr. Landquist and being told by both of them that it's time for the break.